The great assembly hall of Apex Prime Station gleamed under artificial lights that mimicked a dozen different home suns. Species from across the galaxy gathered in their designated sections, their forms as varied as the stars themselves. The Zalthines stood tall on their powerful legs, their scaled skin reflecting pride and arrogance. The Vryn floated in their containment fields, their transparent bodies pulsing with calculated thought. The insectoid Thex chittered quietly among themselves, while the aquatic Meln observed from their water tanks, and the crystalline Korath hummed in resonant frequencies. At the human delegation table, Ambassador Kyle Harris sat with perfect posture, his hands folded on the smooth surface before him. To his left, Lisa Morgan reviewed the proposal documents one final time, though she had memorized every word weeks ago. To his right, Commander Jake Sullivan watched the room with the careful attention of a career military officer, who understood that politics could be as dangerous as any battlefield. 20 years. That was how long humanity had been part of this council, contributing without complaint. 20 years of human doctors curing plagues on alien worlds. 20 years of human engineers solving problems that had stumped galactic experts. 20 years of human ships patrolling the dangerous border regions that the established species found too costly to defend properly. 20 years of hoping that contributions would speak louder than prejudice. Today was supposed to be different. Today the Council would vote on expanding humanity's trade rights and granting them a seat on the Security Directorate. The proposal was fair, backed by an impressive record of service, and supported by careful diplomacy. Lisa had spent months building consensus, meeting with representatives, addressing concerns, and negotiating compromises. The Imperator of the Zalthine rose to speak, his massive form commanding attention. His voice boomed across the chamber, translated instantly into every language present. Kyle listened, his expression neutral, as the Imperator began to discuss the human proposal. "The humans have served adequately," the Imperator declared, his tone making the word "served" sound like a natural state of being. "They performed their assigned tasks with acceptable efficiency. Their medical teams are competent. Their patrol vessels are sufficient for border duty. Their agricultural techniques have proven useful on marginal worlds." Lisa felt her jaw tighten. Adequate, competent, sufficient, useful. These were the words chosen to describe achievements that had saved millions of lives and trillions in economic value. The Imperator continued, warming to his subject. "However, the Security Directorate is reserved for species who have proven their capacity for true leadership. The humans are young, impulsive, and lack the wisdom that comes with millennia of civilization. Perhaps in another century or two, when they have matured, we can revisit this discussion." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the Zalthine delegation. The Imperator was not finished. "I must speak plainly," he said, his voice taking on a patronizing tone that made Jake's hands curl into fists beneath the table. "The humans should be grateful for the privilege of serving their betters. They are useful servants, and there is no shame in that role. Not every species is meant for the heights of galactic leadership. Some are meant to support, to assist, to serve. The humans have found their proper place." The silence that followed was deafening. Kyle's face remained perfectly calm, showing nothing. Lisa's datapad creaked in her grip, the reinforced material protesting against the pressure of her fingers. Jake stared straight ahead, his breathing carefully controlled. The Vryn matriarch spoke next, her translated voice carrying the weight of calculated diplomacy. "The Imperator speaks with characteristic directness, though perhaps I would phrase it more delicately. The human contributions have been adequate for a junior species. They have performed the tasks assigned to them satisfactorily. However, membership in the Security Directorate requires more than competent service. It requires the judgment born of ancient civilizations, the wisdom of species who have guided the galaxy through countless crises. She paused, her body pulsing with what might have been satisfaction. The humans lack this essential quality. Their species is too young, their civilization too brief, their perspective too limited. We value their contributions, truly we do, but they must understand their limitations. Full partnership is not yet appropriate. Kyle waited, giving the other species a chance to speak. The Theks remained silent, their compound eyes reflecting the lights, but revealing no opinion. The Melns stayed in their tanks, offering no comment. The Korath's harmonic resonance suggested discomfort, but they made no official statement. No one spoke in humanity's defense. No one challenged the casual dismissal of 2 decades of sacrifice and service. The vote was called. The result was predictable. The proposal was rejected by a wide margin. The few species who might have supported humanity chose abstention over opposition to the powerful Zalthine and Vryn alliance. Kyle Harris stood slowly, deliberately. The room quieted, expecting protest, argument, perhaps even anger. Human emotions were known to run hot. After all, surely the ambassador would make an impassioned speech, would argue for reconsideration, would demand the respect his species had earned. Instead, Kyle simply nodded once, a gesture of acknowledgement that carried no emotion, no plea, no threat. "Understood," he said, his voice clear and calm. "Humanity will withdraw to consider its position." He gathered his materials with unhurried precision. Lisa and Jake stood with him, matching his composed demeanor. The 3 of them walked toward the exit, their footsteps echoing in the sudden quiet. Other human delegates and staff members joined them, falling into step without a word. Not a single human spoke, not one showed anger or disappointment on their face. They simply left. The great doors of the assembly hall closed behind them with a soft hiss. In the corridor beyond, the human delegation maintained their silence, walking with purpose toward their docking bay. Junior staff members looked to their leaders for guidance, but found only calm determination. The council chamber buzzed back to life within moments. The Imperator was already moving to the next agenda item, something about trade route adjustments. The Vryn matriarch discussed resource allocations with her advisors. The humans were already forgotten, dismissed as easily as they had been rejected. Back on the human transport ship, Kyle finally allowed himself to relax his rigid posture. Lisa set down her cracked datapad and closed her eyes. Jake pulled up communication channels and began sending carefully worded messages to human installations across council space. "Sir," a young aide asked hesitantly, "what happens now?" Kyle looked out the viewport at the massive station growing smaller behind them, at the ships of 100 species coming and going, at the heart of a galactic civilization that had just declared humanity would always be servants. "Now," he said quietly, "we go home, all of us." The ship turned toward Earth, and behind it, a message began spreading through human networks across the galaxy. Simple, clear, undeniable. Captain Ben Clark read the message 3 times before he believed it. The words were simple, the instructions clear, but the implications were staggering. All human personnel were to cease operations in Council space and return to human territory. No exceptions, no delays. Begin immediate evacuation procedures. He stood on the bridge of the Horizon's Edge, a civilian transport ship that had been ferrying medical supplies to Theks colonies for the past 8 months. Below in the cargo holds, Dr. Amy Wells and her team had established a field hospital treating victims of the fungal plague that was ravaging 3 Theks worlds. They were saving lives by the hundreds every day. Ben activated the internal comm. "Dr. Wells, please report to the bridge." Amy arrived within minutes, still wearing her surgical gloves. Her face showed the exhaustion of someone who had been working 18-hour days for months. "Captain, I'm in the middle of a procedure. This better be important." "We're leaving," Ben said simply, handing her the message tablet. Amy's eyes widened as she read. "This is insane. We have patients in critical condition. Some of them won't survive the next 48 hours without continuous treatment. We can't just abandon them." "Those are our orders, Doctor. From Earth, from the top." Ben's voice was gentle but firm. "I'm sorry." "Then get different orders." Amy's voice rose, her professional calm cracking. "Contact Ambassador Harris. Contact the medical authority. Someone has to see reason here." Ben had already tried. The response had been immediate and absolute. There would be no exceptions, no extensions, no negotiations. Every human was coming home. 3 decks down, Amy's team began packing equipment with numb efficiency. The medical staff watched in confusion and growing panic. Through translators they asked questions. Why were the humans leaving? What about the patients? What about the treatment protocols only the humans understood? The human doctors had no answers to give. They simply packed, handed over what records they could, and tried not to look at the faces of patients they knew they were condemning. Across the galaxy, similar scenes played out on 100 worlds. On the agricultural planet Plenty, terraforming specialist Greg Mason stood in the control center of the irrigation network that his team had designed and built. The system turned desert into farmland, feeding billions across Council space. It was sophisticated, efficient, and according to his orders, no longer his problem. "Shut it down," he told his team. "Full systematic shutdown, by the book." "Sir," his assistant protested, "if we shut down now, the crops will fail within 2 weeks. The local engineers don't understand the system well enough to maintain it." "I know," Greg said, his voice heavy, "but we're not sabotaging it. We're just stopping our maintenance. They wanted us as servants, not partners. Servants can quit." He initiated the shutdown sequence, watching as green status lights began turning amber across the display. The system would continue running on automation for a while, but without human oversight and adjustment, it would eventually fail. That was the Council's problem now. At the border monitoring station Sentinel-7, Lieutenant Sophie Kane supervised the evacuation of the human defense personnel. For 2 decades, these stations had been humanity's gift to Council security. Human ships patrolled the dangerous frontier, responding to pirate attacks, tracking hostile movements, and maintaining the sensor networks that kept Council space safe. Now those stations were going dark. Sophie watched as the last shuttle departed, carrying the final crew members. Behind them, the station's lights dimmed to emergency power only. The sensor arrays stopped their constant sweeping. The communication channels fell silent. Sophie's own ship was the last to leave. As she gave the order to undock, she looked at the tactical display showing the vast frontier that they had protected. Without the human patrols, it would be empty, vulnerable. Not her problem anymore. Back at Apex Prime Station, the Council species began to notice the human exodus. At first, they thought it was routine rotation of personnel. Then the scale became apparent. Humans weren't rotating. They were leaving. All of them. A junior Zalthine official tried to contact Kyle Harris. The message was marked as delivered, but never answered. The official sent 3 more messages, each one a bit less confident than the last. All went unanswered. The Vryn matriarch, hearing reports of the human withdrawal, composed a message that she intended to be reconciliatory while maintaining her authority. She suggested that perhaps the humans had overreacted to the Council's decision, and that they should return to their duties once they had calmed down. She framed it as understanding and patient, the way one might address an emotional child. The human response was automated and brief. Message received, no action required. The Thex, facing a medical crisis as the plague spread unchecked without human intervention, sent desperate pleas. They offered better contracts, more resources, public recognition, anything to bring the doctors back. The response was polite, but final. Human medical resources are currently allocated to human populations. We regret we cannot assist at this time. The Meln Consortium, heavily dependent on human trade goods and services, attempted to renegotiate their existing contracts with better terms. Merchant Captain Carl Boyd, who had run cargo routes through Meln space for 15 years, received their generous offer while preparing to depart their largest trading hub. He read it, nodded politely to the Meln representative, and said simply, "We appreciate the offer, but we're consolidating our operations, perhaps in the future." "When?" the Meln asked, its translated voice carrying clear anxiety. "We'll let you know," Carl said, and meant it. Eventually, humanity might return to Council trade, or they might not. It would depend on whether the Council learned to offer respect, along with contracts. Within 2 weeks of Kyle's silent departure from the Assembly Hall, every human had withdrawn behind humanity's original borders. Research stations were abandoned, medical clinics were closed, defense patrols disappeared, trade ships stopped arriving, cultural exchange programs ended, educational liaisons departed, scientific collaborations dissolved. The humans didn't declare war. They didn't issue ultimatums. They didn't make dramatic announcements. They simply stopped being available. The communication channels remained open, but human responses became formal, automated, and unhelpful. Questions were acknowledged, but not answered. Requests were received, but not fulfilled. The Council tried to understand. What did the humans want? What were their demands? What would make them return? But there were no demands. That was what made it so terrifying. The humans weren't negotiating. They weren't leveraging their withdrawal for concessions. They had simply decided that Council space was no longer where they wanted to be. On Earth, Admiral Pete Carson stood in the Fleet Command Center, watching as ships and personnel returned home. The resources that had been scattered across Council space for 2 decades were consolidating. The patrol vessels were being reassigned to explore new territories beyond Council borders. The medical ships were focusing on human colonies that had been neglected, while human doctors saved alien lives. The research teams were pursuing projects that would benefit humanity directly, rather than being shared freely with species who saw them as servants. Scientist Dr. Nina Brooks submitted a revised research budget that redirected billions from collaborative Council projects to independent human endeavors. For years, humanity had shared discoveries freely, building goodwill and demonstrating their value. That time was over. Future discoveries would be human property, licensed under human terms, if the Council wanted access at all. General Lucy Grant, newly appointed as humanity's security chief, received a message from the Zalthine Imperator. It was phrased as an order, demanding that humanity return to fulfill their obligations to Council security. She read it, smiled without humor, and composed a response that was shorter than the Imperator's message title. Humanity has no obligations to the Council. We were never granted full membership. We have no treaty requirements. We owe you nothing. She sent it and returned to planning humanity's new defensive posture. The ships that once protected Council borders were now creating a security perimeter around human space that would make any hostile approach costly and obvious. The galaxy was changing, and for the first time in 20 years, humanity was looking after its own interests first. The fungal plague hit the Thex colony of Kesvara first. What had been a manageable crisis under human medical supervision became a catastrophe within weeks of their departure. The human doctors had not just been treating patients, they had been containing spread, developing new treatments as the plague mutated, and training local medical staff. Without them, all of that stopped. The Thex medical director stood in what had been Amy Wells' office, now empty except for basic furniture. The sophisticated equipment was gone, taken back to human space. The treatment protocols remained, but they were written for human hands and human understanding. The Thex doctors tried to follow them, but the plague was adaptive, changing faster than their ability to respond. In the first week after the humans left, the death rate doubled. By the end of the month, Kesvara was under quarantine, and 5 other Thex colonies were showing early infection signs. The Thex government sent urgent messages to Earth. They begged for help, offered enormous sums of money, promised political support for any future human initiatives. The responses were automated and identical. We regret that our medical resources are currently allocated to pressing needs within human territory. We are unable to provide assistance at this time. No negotiation, no discussion of terms, just a polite refusal. On the agricultural world plenty, the crisis unfolded more slowly, but no less completely. The irrigation system that Greg Mason had built continued running on its automated protocols for 3 weeks. Then the first pumping station failed. The Korath engineers who had worked alongside the humans for years tried to repair it, but they realized they had never truly understood the underlying principles. They had been assistants, following instructions, not true partners in the design. They tried to contact Greg for guidance. The message was received, but not answered. They tried to access the technical documentation, but the detailed schematics had been removed from the shared servers. What remained were basic operational manuals, sufficient for routine tasks, but useless for complex repairs. A second pumping station failed, then a third. The automated systems began shutting down to prevent damage, exactly as they were designed to do. Within 6 weeks of the human departure, 40% of Plenty's irrigation network was offline. The crops began to die. The planet that fed billions across Council space was facing its first famine in 15 years. The Korath sent desperate technical queries to human engineering firms. The firms responded with price quotes for consultation services. The fees were not unreasonable by galactic standards, but they were no longer free. The Korath, accustomed to human assistance as a given, were shocked to discover it had become a commodity. They tried to negotiate. The human firms were polite but firm. Payment in advance. No exceptions. No credit based on past relationships. The Korath Council debated for weeks about whether to pay. By the time they agreed, 3 more pumping stations had failed, and the consultation fees had increased to reflect the greater urgency. But the real crisis came from an unexpected direction. Pirates had always been a problem in the outer reaches of Council space, but human patrols had kept them contained. The pirates struck fast and retreated before the slower Council defense forces could respond. Human ships, with their quick response times and aggressive pursuit tactics, had made piracy unprofitable in most regions. Now those regions were undefended. The first major raid hit a Vryn merchant convoy 6 weeks after the human withdrawal. 3 cargo ships were destroyed, 2 were captured, and the total loss was staggering. The Vryn were outraged and demanded that the Council deploy defense forces immediately. The Council's own fleet responded 3 days later. By then, the pirates were long gone, having sold their captured cargo on black markets in uncontrolled space. The fleet commander filed a report noting that the territory was simply too large to patrol effectively with available resources. He recommended either increasing fleet size by 40% or accepting higher losses to piracy. Neither option was acceptable. 40% fleet expansion would take years and cost more than most Council species were willing to pay. Accepting the losses would devastate trade and make outer colonies economically unviable. Someone suggested hiring human patrol services. The suggestion was rejected immediately by the Zalthine Imperador, who declared that the Council would not be held hostage by servants who forgot their place. The raids continued. A Mel colony transport was hit, leaving a settlement without critical supplies. A Thex research station was raided for valuable equipment. Even a Zalthine military supply depot was attacked, a humiliation that sent shockwaves through the Imperator's court. On Earth, the changes were dramatic. Admiral Pete Carson oversaw the largest peacetime redeployment in human history. The ships that once protected Council borders were exploring new regions beyond known space. Human scout ships had discovered 3 habitable worlds and made contact with 2 new species who had never heard of the Galactic Council. These new species were approached as equals from the first contact. Human diplomats learned their languages, respected their customs, and offered trade agreements that benefited both sides fairly. There was no patronizing attitude, no assumption of superiority, just mutual respect and genuine partnership. One of these new species, the Reth, possessed advanced material science that complemented human engineering. Within months, they had established research exchanges and trade agreements that would have taken decades to negotiate within Council bureaucracy. The humans offered medical technology. The Reth offered metallurgical techniques. Both species prospered. Dr. Nina Brooks stood in her laboratory, working with Reth scientists on a joint project that would never have been possible under Council oversight. The Council's regulations, meant to maintain stability and prevent technological imbalances, had actually stifled innovation. Free from those constraints, human research was leaping forward. Back in Council space, the fractures were deepening. The Meln government sent a formal complaint to the Zalthine Imperator, blaming his needless antagonism of humanity for the current crisis. The Imperator responded with fury, declaring that the Council would not be dictated to by ungrateful primitives, and that the Meln were showing weakness by suggesting compromise. The Theks, watching their colonies die from plague, broke ranks entirely. Their representatives sent a private message to Kyle Harris, apologizing for not speaking up during the vote and begging for medical assistance. They offered full political support for human membership, trade concessions, and public acknowledgement of past mistakes. Kyle's response was brief. "Your words are appreciated. When the Council as a whole is ready to negotiate in good faith, humanity will listen. Until then, we have no business in Council space." The Vryn matriarch, her merchant empire bleeding money from pirate attacks and trade disruptions, finally began to understand the scope of the disaster. She had believed humanity would come back quickly, unable to sustain independence from the galactic economy. She was wrong. Human trade with the Reth and other new species was thriving. Human colonies were becoming self-sufficient. Humanity didn't need the Council. The Council needed humanity. She tried to arrange a private negotiation, sending envoys with generous offers. But the envoys never got past human border stations. The station commanders were polite but immovable. All diplomatic contact went through official channels, and official channels led to automated responses. The Korath, facing economic collapse as their agricultural and technological sectors failed without human support, began making calculations. They were a species that valued logic over pride. The logic was clear. They had taken humanity's contributions for granted. They had treated equals as inferiors. Now they were paying the price. They sent a formal proposal to Earth, offering full support for human council membership, technology sharing agreements, and a public apology for their silence during the vote. Unlike the Theks request or Vryn overtures, this came as an official government position, published for all the galaxy to see. The human response was slightly less automated. "Your proposal is noted and will be considered. Humanity appreciates the Koroth government's forthrightness." It wasn't acceptance, but it wasn't a refusal. It was the first crack in the wall of silence. The Zalthine Imperator, watching his carefully constructed political coalition collapse, made a final attempt at reasserting authority. He sent a message that was broadcast across all council channels, declaring that humanity was violating the spirit of galactic cooperation, and that there would be consequences if they did not resume their proper duties. General Lucy Grant watched the broadcast and laughed. Consequences? The Council could barely defend itself from pirates. Their agricultural systems were failing. Their medical services were overwhelmed. Their economy was struggling. What consequences could they possibly impose? She composed no response at all. The Imperator's threats didn't deserve one. The first warning came from a remote Korath observatory on the edge of Council space. Unusual energy signatures, mass readings that didn't match any known vessel type, movement patterns suggesting coordinated fleet action. The Korath scientists checked their instruments 3 times before sending the alert. By the time the Council took the warning seriously, it was too late. The Zulkor swarm emerged from the depths of space like a nightmare given form. Their ships were organic and mechanical at once, grown and built in equal measure. They didn't communicate. They didn't negotiate. They simply attacked. The outer Zalthine colonies were hit first. The defense stations that should have provided early warning were undermanned and poorly maintained since the human withdrawal. The Zalthine fleet responded as quickly as their bureaucracy allowed, which meant 3 days after the first attack. They arrived to find 2 colonies destroyed and a third under assault. The Zalthine ships engaged with the confidence of a species that had ruled Council space for centuries. That confidence lasted exactly 14 minutes, before the swarm tore through their formation like it was made of paper. Admiral Kestor, commanding the Zalthine Third Fleet, watched in horror as his ships were systematically dismantled. The swarm's tactics were unlike anything he had encountered. They moved with perfect coordination, exploited every weakness, and adapted to Zalthine weapons in real time. His flagship took critical damage, and he gave the order to retreat. Half his fleet didn't make it out. The Vryn were next. A swarm tendril struck at their merchant hub world, a planet that served as a vital economic center. The Vryn defense platforms were sophisticated, built with the best technology Council credits could buy. The swarm ignored them, drove straight through the defensive fire, and landed forces on the planet's surface. The Vryn matriarch watched from her chambers as live feeds showed swarm forces moving through her cities. They didn't occupy. They harvested. Resources, technology, anything of value was stripped away with terrifying efficiency. When they left 3 days later, the planet was an economic ruin. The smaller species panicked. The Theks, already weakened by plague, evacuated their border colonies entirely. The Meln pulled their forces back to core territories. The Korath ran probability calculations and concluded that without intervention, Council space would fall within 6 months. The emergency Council session was chaos. Species that had cooperated for centuries turned on each other. The Zalthine blamed the Vryn for poor intelligence. The Vryn blamed the Zalthine for military incompetence. The Meln accused both of wasting resources on pride instead of preparation. The Thek simply pleaded for anyone to do something. It was the Korath who said what everyone was thinking, but none wanted to admit. We need the humans. The Zalthine Imperator, his pride wounded but his survival instinct stronger, refused to accept this. The Council does not beg for help from servants. We will adapt our strategies, increase production, and we will die. The Korath representative interrupted, which was unheard of in Council protocol. You have seen the projections. You know the mathematics. Without human tactical expertise, without their defensive coordination, without their rapid response capabilities, we cannot win this war. The Imperator's response was to demand rather than ask. He composed a message to Earth that framed humanity's military deployment as a duty to civilized species and an obligation to the galactic community. It was phrased as an order, as if the Council still had authority over human actions. Admiral Pete Carson received the message while reviewing reports from human scout ships exploring new territories. He read it twice, set it aside, and continued his work. An hour later, he recorded a response. The message was broadcast not just to the Council leadership, but publicly, across all galactic channels. Carson's face appeared on screens throughout Council space, his expression calm and professional. The Galactic Council has requested humanity's military intervention against the Zul-Kor swarm. I want to be clear about humanity's position. We have no treaty obligation to the Council. We have no defensive pact. We have no formal alliance. 3 months ago, the Council made it clear that humanity's role was to serve, not to partner. Servants don't command fleets. He paused, letting that sink in. Humanity's military forces are currently deployed defending humanity's interests, protecting humanity's citizens, and securing humanity's future. We wish the Council well in their conflict, but we have no responsibility for their defense. The message ended. Simple, final, devastating. The Council was stunned into silence. The Imperator raged in his chambers, throwing things and shouting about human insolence. The Vryn matriarch ran calculations and realized that pride had finally exceeded its value. The Melm quietly began evacuation plans. The Fex wept. But the Korath did something different. They authorized a real diplomatic mission. Not a message or an envoy, but a full delegation led by Chancellor Ven himself. One of the few council members who had privately opposed humanity's treatment from the beginning. Ven was old, even by Korath standards, and wise enough to know when principles mattered more than politics. He had disagreed with the Imperator's decision, had argued against it in private sessions, but had ultimately remained silent during the public vote. That silence now felt like the greatest failure of his long career. His ship approached Earth's orbital control, and for the first time in months, a Council vessel was granted permission to enter human space. But permission came with conditions. No weapons, no escort, just one small diplomatic ship. Ven stood in the landing bay of Earth's primary space station, looking at the faces of the humans who met him. There was Kyle Harris, the ambassador whose silence had been more damning than any speech. There was Lisa Morgan, whose cracked datapad had been quietly famous across diplomatic channels. And there was a woman Ven hadn't met before, introduced as President Ellen Shaw. They sat in a plain conference room, without ceremony or formality. Ven had prepared speeches, had practiced diplomatic phrases and careful negotiations. He set all of that aside. "I apologize," he said simply, "not just for the insult 3 months ago, but for decades of condescension, for treating your contributions as expected rather than valued, for taking your sacrifices for granted, for remaining silent when I should have spoken." Kyle's expression didn't change. "Words cost nothing, Chancellor." "I know," Ven agreed. "That's why I'm not here to offer just words. The Korath government is prepared to support full human membership in the Council, with all rights and privileges. We will publicly acknowledge our past mistakes. We will support human leadership in the Security Directorate. We will share technologies we have previously withheld. And we understand that none of this may be enough." President Shaw leaned forward. "You understand correctly, Chancellor. For 20 years we gave freely. Medicine, technology, protection, lives. We asked only for respect and partnership. We were denied. Now you need us desperately, and you're offering apologies and concessions. What changed? Our value or your desperation?" Ven met her gaze steadily. "Both, if I'm honest. But more importantly, our understanding changed. We thought we were granting you the privilege of serving us. We were wrong. You were granting us the privilege of your service, and we were too blind to see it." The room was quiet for a long moment. Kyle and Lisa exchanged glances. President Shaw studied Ven's face, looking for deception or manipulation, and finding only weary honesty. "We'll help," President Shaw said finally, "but not as servants, not as junior partners, not as supplicants grateful for the opportunity, as equals. Full council membership, full voting rights, full access to all council resources and information. Restitution for the resources we provided freely before, and a complete restructuring of council governance to ensure this never happens again." "Done," Ven said immediately. "All of it. I have full authority from the Koroth government to agree to any terms." "You don't speak for the full council," Lisa pointed out. "No," Ven admitted, "but I speak for the Koroth, and our support will force the others to follow. The Imperator will resist, but his fleet is broken. The Matriarch will calculate and realize she has no choice. The Meln and Fex will agree eagerly. The Council will accept your terms because the alternative is extinction." Kyle finally spoke. "When we deploy, Chancellor, it won't be to save the Council. It will be to stop the swarm from becoming a threat to human space. The Council's survival will be a side effect, not our primary goal." "I understand," Ven said quietly. "And I suppose we deserve nothing more." The human fleet arrived at the edge of Council space without fanfare or grand announcements. They simply appeared, their ships moving with the practiced precision of a military force that had used the past 3 months wisely. While the Council had been fracturing and the swarm had been advancing, humanity had been preparing. Admiral Pete Carson stood on the bridge of the flagship Defiant, studying the tactical displays. The swarm had taken significant territory, but they had made a mistake. They had assumed Council space was their only opposition. They hadn't accounted for humanity's return, and they certainly hadn't expected the technology humans had been keeping in reserve. The first engagement was almost surgical. A swarm fleet was advancing on a Fex colony when human ships dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the perfect intercept point. The swarm vessels moved to engage, expecting the same tactics they had easily countered from Council forces. They were wrong. Captain Claire Stevens commanded the strike group from her ship, the Relentless. Her tactical officer had analyzed every recorded swarm engagement, looking for patterns and weaknesses. They had found plenty. The swarm was adaptive, but they adapted to what they encountered. They had never encountered human combat doctrine. The human ships didn't engage in traditional formation combat. They moved like a school of fish, each vessel independent yet coordinated. When the swarm tried to exploit what looked like a gap in the formation, they found themselves caught in a crossfire. When they adapted to the crossfire, the formation had already shifted to something new. "Target their command ship," Claire ordered. "I want it crippled, not destroyed." Her weapons officer executed the command with precision. Humanity had spent 20 years quietly observing Council military technology, learning and improving. The directed energy weapons that lanced out from the Relentless were generations ahead of anything the Council possessed. The swarm command ship took catastrophic damage to its propulsion and communication systems. Cut off from the rest of the fleet, unable to coordinate, the swarm vessels hesitated for the first time in the entire war. That hesitation was fatal. The human ships pressed the advantage, and within 30 minutes, the swarm fleet was destroyed or retreating. The Fex colony was saved. The human fleet moved to the next engagement point before the colonists could even send their thanks. On the ground, the situation was different, but no less effective. Swarm forces had occupied a Vryn industrial world, and rooting them out required boots on the ground. Lieutenant Dan Cooper led a Marine company in the assault on the main swarm position. The swarm fought with biological weapons and swarm tactics, exactly as their name suggested. They overwhelmed enemies with numbers and ferocity. Council ground forces had struggled against these tactics, losing soldiers at terrible rates. Human Marines had a different approach. Dan's company used coordinated fire teams, overlapping fields of fire, and weapons designed specifically for the swarm's biological vulnerabilities. They had studied the enemy, learned from Council failures, and developed countermeasures. "Suppressing fire on the left," Dan called out. "Second team, advance. Third team, hold position and watch for flankers." The battle was brutal but short. The swarm forces were driven back, then encircled, then eliminated. The industrial complex was retaken with minimal human casualties. Dan's after-action report was studied by every human ground commander in the fleet. Across Council space, the pattern repeated. Human forces arrived, engaged, and won. Not every battle was easy. Not every victory was clean. Humans died defending worlds that had called them servants 3 months ago. But they were winning. The turning point came when the human fleet located the swarm's main staging area, a massive asteroid cluster they had converted into a forward base. Admiral Carson assembled the largest human task force of the war, including ships that had been exploring beyond Council space, and were recalled for this operation. Commander Ryan Mitchell, serving as tactical coordinator, planned the assault with care. "They'll expect a direct assault. We give them something else. First wave draws their attention. Second wave hits from an unexpected angle. Third wave takes out their logistics." It was the hardest-fought engagement of the entire war. 3 human ships were destroyed. 7 more took heavy damage. But when it was over, the swarm's forward base was debris, and their ability to sustain operations in Council space was broken. The swarm didn't surrender, because they weren't a species that negotiated. But they retreated, pulling back to wherever they had come from. Without their forward base, without their command structure, without their momentum, they were no longer a threat. Council space was saved. But the galaxy had changed. The emergency council session that followed the war's end was different from any that had come before. Kyle Harris didn't sit in the visitors section. He sat at the council table itself, holding humanity's new permanent seat. The vote had been unanimous. Even the Zalthine Imperator had supported it, though his speech had been notably brief. The Imperator himself was a diminished figure. His military failures had cost him political support, and there were already rumors of challenges to his authority. He sat quietly, no longer the dominating voice he had once been. The Vryn matriarch had been more graceful in defeat. She had publicly thanked humanity for their intervention, and acknowledged that the Council's treatment of humanity had been regrettably short-sighted. It was as close to an apology as the Vryn gave. The real changes went deeper than words. The Council's charter was being rewritten. The Security Directorate was restructured, with humanity holding one of the 5 permanent seats. Trade regulations were simplified, ending the preferential treatment that had favored older species. Technology sharing agreements were made reciprocal and fair. But perhaps most importantly, the definition of membership changed. No longer would species be classified by age or technological advancement. Contribution and capability would matter more than how long a species had been traveling the stars. On the Thex colonies, Dr. Amy Wells returned to her work, but this time she had proper funding, modern facilities, and Thex medical staff who were trained as partners rather than assistants. The plague was being brought under control, and the collaborative research was producing breakthroughs that neither species could have achieved alone. On Plenty, Greg Mason oversaw the restoration of the irrigation systems. But now, humanity owned 40% of the agricultural output, a fair compensation for the technology and expertise they provided. The Korath engineers worked alongside human specialists, this time truly learning the principles behind the systems. Captain Ben Clark's transport ship, the Horizon's Edge, resumed its trade routes through Council space. But the contracts were different now. Fair rates, equal partnerships. No more expectations that humans would work for goodwill and vague promises. The human patrol routes were re-established, but now they were joint operations with Council forces. Human tactical expertise combined with Council resources created a defensive network stronger than either could have built alone. Pirates found that their brief window of opportunity had closed, and the consequences of raiding were now swift and severe. In the rebuilt Council chamber, Kyle Harris stood with Lisa Morgan, looking out at the diplomatic quarter where ships from 100 species came and went. "Do you think they've learned?" Lisa asked quietly. Kyle considered the question. "Some have. Chancellor Venn understands what happened and why. The Fex learned the hard way when their colonies were dying. The Korath ran the numbers and accepted reality. Even the Matriarch calculated the cost of pride and decided it was too high. And the Imperator? He learned that strength without wisdom is just waiting to fail." Kyle watched a Zalthine ship depart, smaller than the massive vessels they once fielded. His species is rebuilding. Maybe they'll be wiser next time. Maybe not. "And humanity?" Lisa asked. "What did we learn?" Kyle smiled slightly. "We learned that respect isn't given for free, that serving others is only valuable if it's appreciated, that walking away is sometimes the strongest thing you can do." Far below, in the diplomatic quarter, a Wreth ship docked at the human embassy. The partnership humanity had built, beyond Council space, continued to flourish. Human territory had expanded, new trade routes were established, and species the Council had never met were now regular partners. Humanity was no longer dependent on the Council for economic survival or political legitimacy. They had options. They had leverage. They had the freedom to choose their own path. And that made all the difference. President Ellen Shaw, back on Earth, reviewed reports from across human space. The past 3 months had been transformative. Human colonies were thriving. New settlements were being established. Research was advancing at unprecedented rates. The resources that had been poured into supporting the Council were now invested in humanity's future. She approved a new exploration mission to regions even farther beyond node space. Humanity would continue to expand, to grow, to reach outward. They would work with the Council when it was mutually beneficial. They would maintain their defenses. They would remember the lessons learned. But they would never again beg for respect. They would never again give freely to those who took them for granted. They would never again mistake tolerance for acceptance or service for partnership. In the military academy on Mars, the recent war was already being studied. Young officers analyzed the tactics, the strategies, the decisions that had turned the tide. But the most important lesson wasn't about weapons or formations. It was about knowing your worth. The humans had walked away in silence, and in their absence, the galaxy learned what humanity had been worth all along. Not servants, not juniors, not useful tools to be patronized and dismissed. Equals. And now, when human ships patrolled Council space, when human doctors treated alien patients, when human engineers solved impossible problems, it was as partners, as members, as equals. The silence had spoken louder than any protest could have. The absence had taught what presence never could.